I joined the swim team to prove something to myself, but I never expected my coach to be the one thing I couldn't resist. He was tall, athletic, and completely out of my league. But the way he looked at me, the way his hands lingered just a little too long during training, I knew I wasn't imagining it. What started as stolen glances turned into something much deeper, much more dangerous. But secrets don't stay hidden forever. And what we had, it was never meant to last. Before we dive into this intense and emotional story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our captivating stories. The pool smelled like chlorine and ambition. I stood at the edge, my fingers gripping the cool metal of the starting block, heart pounding harder than it should. This was my first day training under him. Caleb Vaughn. The man was a legend, a former Olympic swimmer, now head coach of the university's elite swim team. He was everything you'd expect a professional athlete to be. Tall, broad-shouldered, a body sculpted by years in the water, and somehow impossibly beautiful. I'd seen him in photos before, watched clips of his old competitions, but nothing had prepared me for seeing him up close. The way his wet, tousled hair clung to his forehead, the way his navy blue swim trunks fit a little too perfectly. I should have been thinking about my form, about proving myself on my first day with the team. But instead, all I could think was, don't stare. Don't let him catch you staring. Reed, right? My breath caught. I turned, and there he was, Caleb Vaughn, standing right beside me, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes locked onto mine. Jesus. Up close, he was even more intimidating. His sharp jawline, the way his muscles flexed with the slightest movement. I swallowed hard. Yeah, Reed Walker. His lips twitched in something between a smirk and an assessment. You're late to the team. Most of these guys have been training for years. I know, I said, trying to sound steady. I'll work twice as hard. Caleb's gaze flickered down my body, scanning, not in a way that felt inappropriate, but like he was analyzing every inch of me, judging my potential. Good, he murmured. I don't waste my time with people who don't give everything. I nodded, exhaling. I won't disappoint you, Coach. Something unreadable passed over his face. We'll see. The first hour was brutal. Caleb wasn't easy on me. The drills were relentless, the laps endless. My muscles burned by the time he called for a break. I pulled myself out of the water, panting, water dripping down my skin. I wasn't the best on the team, not even close, but I wasn't giving up. I caught Caleb watching me. It was quick, just a flicker of his eyes before he turned away. But I felt it. That was when it started. The subtle glances when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his hands lingered just a second too long when he corrected my form. The way his voice dropped lower when he spoke only to me. Was it in my head? Or was there something between us? I didn't have time to think about it before he called my name again. Walker, stay back after practice. I froze. The other guys groaned, complaining that I was getting extra training. But I wasn't complaining. I was terrified and thrilled. The pool was quiet when everyone else left. Caleb stood by the edge, arms folded, watching me. Your form is solid, he said, but your breathing's off. You're holding back. I hesitated. Get back in the water. I obeyed without thinking, slipping into the pool. The cold shock of it grounded me. Caleb crouched at the edge, so close now. Come here. I swam toward him, stopping just inches away. His fingers brushed my jaw, tilting my chin slightly. My pulse spiked. You need to loosen up, he said, his voice quieter. He was so close. His fingers were still on me, his touch barely there, but enough.
Something shifted in his expression, like he realized just how close we were, like he knew. My breath hitched. His hand dropped. Caleb stood up abruptly, exhaling hard. "That's enough for today." I stayed frozen in the water, my entire body on fire. He turned without another word, walking toward his office, but I saw the way his hand clenched at his side. And I knew this wasn't just me. Something had just started, something we weren't ready for. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the pool. Caleb's fingers on my jaw, his voice low, his presence overwhelming. I wasn't imagining it. I felt it. The shift, the hesitation, the tension crackling between us like an unspoken secret. And yet, the next morning, when I walked into practice, he was the same Caleb Vaughn. Cold, strict, untouchable. The drills were relentless. Caleb pushed me harder than before. Every time I came up gasping for air, his voice cut through the noise. "Faster! Again! You can do better than that, Walker." I didn't complain. I wanted to impress him. Maybe I wanted more than that. I felt his eyes on me every time I pulled myself out of the water, every time I wiped the sweat and chlorine from my face. But he never said anything, never lingered, like last night hadn't happened. And yet, when I caught his gaze through the reflection of the pool, I saw it, the flicker of something he was trying to bury. After practice, I stayed behind again. I didn't ask why. We both knew. The others had left, the pool was empty, and the sun was beginning to set outside the large glass windows. Caleb stood at the edge, arms crossed, watching me tread water. "Come here." My stomach twisted. I swam toward him, my pulse quickening as I reached the ledge. Déjà vu. Caleb crouched down, forearms resting on his knees, eyes locked on mine. "You're still hesitating," he murmured. I swallowed. "I don't—" He reached out, not to my face this time, but to my shoulder. His touch was firm, steady, fingers pressing against my skin. I exhaled sharply. He was testing me, pushing. I didn't move away. I couldn't. "Loosen up," he said again, but his voice sounded different this time, quieter. His fingers trailed down, barely there, just brushing the edge of my collarbone before pulling back. It was nothing, and it was everything. I saw it again, the slight clench of his jaw, the flicker of hesitation, but just as quickly as it came, he shut it down. Caleb pulled back, exhaling hard. "That's enough for today." I gripped the ledge, my entire body tight with frustration. "What is this?" I said before I could stop myself. He didn't answer, just stood, rubbing a hand over his face. I pushed myself up onto the ledge, water dripping off me, heart pounding. "You keep doing this, pushing me, testing me, then acting like nothing's happening." Caleb turned to me, eyes dangerous now. "Nothing is happening." Bullshit. I stepped closer. Caleb didn't move. I could feel the heat of his body, the tension thick enough to drown in. He should have walked away. He should have told me to leave. But he didn't. Instead, he stared at me, breathing hard, his fingers twitching at his sides like he wanted to grab me. I don't know who moved first, if it was me or him or both of us at the same time, but suddenly my wet hands were on his chest, and he was grabbing my wrist, holding me still. We weren't touching much, but it was too much. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Reed," he warned. "This can't happen." His grip on my wrist tightened. "Then let go." He didn't. For a second, just 1 second, I swore he was going to break. His fingers flexed, his chest rising and falling against my hands, his breath shallow. But then, he stepped back, like it took everything in him to do it. His voice was rough. "Go home, Walker."
I stood there, stunned, shaking, wanting. He turned without another word, walked away, left me standing at the edge of the pool, my heart breaking for something that had barely even begun. I should have let it go. I should have gone home, pretended nothing happened, acted like Caleb Vaughn was just my coach. Nothing more. But that was impossible. Because every time I closed my eyes, I was back there. His grip on my wrist, his breath against my skin, his voice rough with something he wouldn't let himself say. Then let go. But he hadn't. And that meant everything. The next few practices were brutal. Caleb pushed me harder than ever. Longer sets, faster sprints, fewer breaks. It was like he was trying to exhaust me so I wouldn't have time to think. But it wasn't working. Because every time our eyes met across the pool, I saw it. The tension, the hesitation, the thing he was trying so damn hard to bury. And then it happened again. I stayed after practice, like before. I told myself I needed the extra training. But that was a lie. I was waiting. And just like before, he came to me. The pool was empty, except for us. The water still, the scent of chlorine thick in the air. Caleb leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. You're still here. So are you. He exhaled sharply, pushing off the wall. Get in. I obeyed, slipping into the pool, watching as he stepped onto the deck above me. His silhouette against the overhead lights was almost too much to look at. Caleb crouched down, forearms resting on his knees. His voice was quieter this time. You want this, don't you? I froze. I felt my pulse slam through my veins, my fingers curling around the cool ledge of the pool. I could lie. I could say I didn't know what he meant, but I was done pretending. I nodded, my throat dry. Yes. His jaw tightened. His breathing changed. Something cracked between us. And then, he reached for me. His fingers slid into my wet hair, pulling me forward, closer. I gasped softly as my body bumped against the edge, trapped between the pool and him. Caleb. He exhaled shakily, his grip tightening for just a second. Then, he let go, stepped back, like he was forcing himself to breathe. This can't happen, he whispered. But it wasn't convincing anymore. I swallowed. Why not? His eyes burned into mine. You know why. I did. He was my coach. I was his swimmer. This wasn't allowed. But it was already happening. I pulled myself up onto the deck, water streaming down my skin. And for the first time, he didn't step away. We stood there, inches apart, the entire world shrinking to just this. I could feel his breath against my lips. His fingers twitched at his sides. I didn't think. I moved. Just enough to close the distance, to feel the heat of his skin against mine. And then he kissed me. It was fast. Hard. A mistake he was making in real time. But neither of us stopped. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer, his lips crushing against mine. I gasped into his mouth, gripping his shoulders, losing myself in him. And then, he ripped himself away. Like he'd just realized what he'd done. He turned, breathing hard, rubbing a hand over his face. Shit. I stood there, my lips still burning, my entire body shaking. He wouldn't look at me. And that's when I knew. This wasn't a beginning. It was a ticking time bomb. Caleb didn't look at me, not as he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, not as he turned away, breathing hard, his shoulders rising and falling like he'd just surfaced from deep underwater, like he was drowning in something he didn't want to name. I swallowed, my lips still burning from his kiss, from him. It had lasted seconds, barely enough time for me to react, to process the heat of his body, the way his hands had tightened around my waist like he couldn't stop himself. But now he was running. "Caleb," I started, voice hoarse. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That shouldn't have happened." I blinked. "Are you serious?" Finally, he looked at me, and the way his dark eyes burned with conflict almost made me step back. "I'm your coach, Reed." His voice was rough. "This is wrong." I let out a hollow laugh. "Then why did you kiss me?" His jaw tightened. For a second, just a second, I thought he might say the truth, that he wanted this, that he felt the same thing I did, the pull, the gravity, the undeniable chemistry that had been building from the moment I stepped into his pool. But instead, he shut down. "This can't happen," he said, cold now, like he hadn't just kissed me, like he was starving for it, like he wasn't still looking at my mouth. I exhaled, my chest tight. "You're really gonna pretend?" Caleb turned away, running a hand through his damp hair. "I'm not pretending." I scoffed. "Bullshit." Something flickered in his gaze, a crack in his composure. But before I could push him, before I could demand more, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. My stomach dropped. Shit. Someone was coming. Caleb's expression shifted instantly, snapping back into place like a mask. "Go," he ordered. I hesitated. He stepped closer, too close, too fast, gripping my wrist just like he had before. His voice lowered. "Reed, go." I didn't have a choice. The door swung open just as I slipped out the side exit, my heart hammering in my chest. I barely heard what was being said. Some assistant coach asking Caleb something, completely unaware that his head coach had just kissed one of his swimmers, that he was still standing there, breathing hard, like it took everything in him not to chase after me. I stumbled into the locker room, my reflection catching in the mirror. My hair was damp, my lips were swollen, my pulse wouldn't slow down. I pressed my fingers to my mouth, exhaling shakily. I should have felt guilty. But all I could feel was the way Caleb's hands had grabbed me, desperate, hungry before pushing me away. This wasn't over. I knew it. And so did he. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I told myself that Caleb Vaughn had made his choice. That the kiss, that brief, burning moment where he had held me, wanted me, let himself have me, meant nothing to him. That I should let it go. But I couldn't, because every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel his hands on me, the weight of his breath against my lips, the way his entire body had tensed when I didn't pull away. And I knew that if I walked into that pool again, it would happen all over, because he wanted it too, even if he'd never admit it. I showed up to practice like nothing had happened. Caleb didn't look at me, not once, but he also didn't tell me to leave. And that silence, that was everything. I pushed harder than ever in training, keeping up with the other guys, waiting for him to snap, to say my name, to acknowledge me. He didn't. Not until practice ended, and the others left, and it was just us again, alone in the quiet pool. He stood near the water, jaw tight, arms crossed, looking like a man trying to hold himself together. I should have walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped into the pool, swimming toward him, the same way I always did. Caleb watched me, his hands curling into fists at his sides. I stopped at the ledge, dripping wet, breathing hard, waiting. His voice was low, rough. "Why are you still here, Reed?" I swallowed. "Why do you keep letting me stay?" Something snapped in his gaze, and suddenly, he moved. He grabbed my arm, yanked me up onto the deck so fast I barely had time to breathe before I was standing in front of him, water dripping onto the tile between us. I was barely catching my breath before his hands were on me, gripping my face, pulling me in. And then he kissed me, hard, hungry, like he was done pretending. I barely had time to react before his hands slid down my back, pressing me against him, his body solid, burning hot against my soaked skin. I gasped into his mouth, my fingers curling around his biceps, feeling every tense muscle, every ounce of restraint that he had finally let go of. This was real. This wasn't some accident, some mistake. This was Caleb Vaughn kissing me like he couldn't stop himself, and I kissed him back like I never wanted him to. His hands clenched around my waist, pulling me closer, his breath heavy against my lips. Then, he broke away. His chest heaved, his eyes dark with something dangerous. "This is wrong," he whispered, but his hands were still on me. I grabbed his wrist, holding him there. "Then why does it feel like the only thing that makes sense?" He didn't answer, but he didn't let go. And that was all I needed to know. We stood there, breathing hard, hearts racing, bodies too close. Caleb's hands were still on me, his grip firm, like he couldn't bring himself to let go. His chest rose and fell against mine, his skin burning even through the cold dampness of my own. This was it, the moment we either fell apart or fell deeper. I swallowed hard. "Say it." His jaw tightened. "Say what?" "Say you don't want me," I whispered. "Say you regret it." I waited for him to push me away, to tell me this was over, that it had never meant anything. But he just stood there, breathing, shaking, because we both knew the truth. He wanted this. He wanted me. But sometimes, wanting something isn't enough. We didn't talk after that night, not in the way that mattered. At practice, he was my coach again. Cold, unreadable, as if his lips hadn't been on mine just days ago. But I saw it. The way his eyes flickered toward me when he thought no one was looking. The way his jaw clenched whenever I stepped out of the pool, water dripping down my chest, his gaze trailing just a second too long before snapping away. The tension was unbearable, and I was breaking, so I confronted him. "Tell me this is over," I demanded, cornering him in the empty locker room after practice. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Reed, tell me it didn't mean anything." His hands curled into fists. "You know I can't." "Then why are you running from me?" Silence. Then, his voice dropped. "Because I'll ruin you." I stared at him. "What?" His jaw clenched. "I can't be what you need, Reed." His voice was raw, barely above a whisper. "I can't give you the future you want. I can't be out in the open. And you deserve better than that." I felt the air leave my lungs. He was choosing fear over me. "Say you don't love me," I said, my throat tight. "Say it and I'll walk away." His breath hitched. I saw it, the way his fingers twitched like he wanted to grab me, pull me in, tell me I was wrong, but instead he closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were empty. "I don't love you." The words hit harder than a slap. I felt something inside me shatter. I searched his face, desperate for a crack, a hesitation, something to prove he was lying. But all I saw was a man who had already decided. I nodded slowly, my chest aching. "Goodbye, Caleb." And this time, I was the one who walked away. The pool still smelled like chlorine and heartbreak, but I never saw him again. And maybe, somewhere in the silence of the water, he still thought about me too.